Mike's on Mike, a conversation about politics, government, and Jacksonville, with 50-year opinion leaders Mike Hightower, Mike Tolbert, and award-winning broadcaster and longtime political observer, Mike Miller.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Mike's on Mike. I'm Mike Miller, and Mike Hightower is with me here in studio. Mike Tolbert is out at the farm, and it's great to have you with us. Mike's on Mike brought to you by the Jacksonville Historical Society, which is located inside the Jacksonville History Center, and we thank Alan Bliss and the fine donors and supporters of our program for their help and their encouragement, which we love that as well. Our guest today is veteran Florida Times-Union reporter David Bauerlein, who joined the Times-Union staff back in 1998. David covers Jacksonville City Hall and government authorities, including the JEA, which we might touch upon a little bit later on. David, thanks so much for being with us. It's great to be with you.
Hey, great to be here.
Thank you very, very much. Just after the first of the year, David came out with a story that struck me, and I called the guys right away and said, we've got to do this. David wrote an article about the 8 news developments in Jacksonville to watch in 2024, and that's what we want to talk with him about today. First, David, you called the biggest story to watch in 2024 the negotiations between the city and Shad Khan and the Jaguars. The mayor says she wants this on her desk, or at least entered by spring, and as my friend Mr. Hightower pointed out before the show, spring is already here.
Spring is March 19th, June 20th.
Right.
So what's the status of those negotiations? Are they going to meet? Is she going to meet that deadline?
It seems like she's confident that they will be able to meet that deadline. So I think they meet regularly. It's Mike Weinstein representing her. Mike was a veteran of City Hall and was actually part of the team that negotiated way back when the Super Bowl, when Jacksonville landed the Super Bowl. He was part of the team that negotiated when the Jaguars came to Jacksonville as a franchise. So he's a veteran negotiator in this regard. And of course, Mark Lamping is leading the negotiations on behalf of the Jaguars. They're negotiating regularly. I think it sounds like they are making progress. And the mayor, every time she has these press gaggles, she's really stuck with that idea of having something, at least a framework is the way she describes it, by April or May. And then they would go out into the public and get feedback from the public. Here's what we're looking at. Here's kind of the design. Here's what it looks like. Here's what the cost would be. Those kind of big picture things to see what people feel about moving to the next level, which would be then taking to city council. And that could happen in the summer. So obviously these negotiations, there's always the final 10%, maybe it's the 90%. There's a lot of issues, and it's not just the stadium. You have to remember it's also the lease itself. That's a very complicated thing. Yep. What if the Jaguars were to leave before the lease is up? What's the penalty to them in terms of the city's recouping that cost? How is the property around the stadium going to be used or not used for economic development? So there's a lot of those issues that are really big. And then the mayor's also made a big point that she'd really like to see any deal have some benefits to neighborhoods near the stadium, specifically the East Side neighborhood. It's also called Out East now, which is on the other side of that elevated expressway to the Matthews Bridge, which kind of feels like it's close but so far away from the stadium complex, and finding ways to sort of create some economic development as well for that neighborhood in conjunction with all these investment, which is a massive amount of money the city would be putting into the stadium.
So what you're looking at is during the next 90 days, a framework and then a community conversation?
Pretty much, yeah. Similar to what the Jaguars did last summer. They did these community huddles, except this would be the mayor leading those conversations. I think the main things are, the stadium is really the focal point of the negotiations. There had been talk earlier about doing some sort of big entertainment district as part of it. That component of it doesn't really seem to have advanced very far in negotiations.
I was going to ask you about that.
So you're looking at a stadium.
Good.
Which would be...
I agree.
I agree. Mr. Tolbert has weighed in.
Yeah. Which would be like about $1.4 billion. I mean, just a huge amount of money for the stadium itself. And then the big question is, how do you split the cost? Mm-hmm. What percent is Shad Khan putting up? What percent is the city putting up? And that, I think, is still a matter of negotiations.
So it's all about the money.
It's about the money in terms of definitely
who's paying how much.
Who's paying how much, and the other part is to what extent are the Jaguars? How does the lease affect the team in terms of if in the future it ever left? How does that affect the city taxpayers? Again, about the money.
Doesn't all of this though still have to go to the NFL for approval?
It does. So there's two routes. One of us is city council, obviously, and the mayor, but the NFL also has to sign off on it. So that's, there's a committee there, the owners have to support it. Mm-hmm. So you have two audiences for this. It would be hard to see that the Jaguars would reach a deal with the city and then go to the NFL and the NFL owners would say no to it. On the other hand, the Jaguars probably are, and they've said this publicly, that, they need a deal that they can get a yes from the owners. So that's a factor there. And so that's why a lot of the comparables are to what have the NFL done in the past for these type of stadiums in other cities.
You want to handicap it? Is it what's going to happen and what's it going to cost the taxpayer?
So I think it'll be about a $1.4 billion stadium. I mean, there does not seem to be anything that has emerged as far as we understand it at this point that's a different design from what the Jaguars unveiled last summer.
It is.
So those renderings you saw, that seems to be kind of what they're working off of. And that is about a $1.4 billion renovation. And then for the cost breakdown, that's a good question, Mike. Up until now, a lot of these deals have been 50-50 between the city and like on the amphitheater, that was a 50-50 deal. Right. On the sports performance center, which is basically their practice stadium.
At the Miller Electric Field.
Miller Electric Field. There you go. There's that name, Mike. The Mike Miller Electric
Field. I don't want it. I wouldn't mind good tickets, but I don't want the stadium.
Yeah, I was going to talk to you about some good tickets.
So that was 50-50. I'd be surprised if it's 50-50 this time. I mean, that would mean the Jaguars would be putting up $700 million.
Plus, we'd want 50% of all the revenue coming in.
Right. And so but that's just, again, that would be probably the city's goal, would get to a 50-50 on it. Right. If the Jaguars could agree to that, and there's a lot of different components in the negotiations, not just the money, but the lease, what that looks like. But my guess is that it's going to be the city picking up a bigger share of the funding for a city-owned stadium than the Jaguars do.
Mr. Tolbert.
Yeah, David, first of all, thank you for your great work day in and day out. We're really grateful to you for letting us know what's going on down there. I have a couple of questions. One of them regards Mayor Deegan's engagement in the process. I know she's got Weinstein and they hired a law firm. Tell us about the law firm, but tell us, is she engaged or is she depending mostly on her team to do this?
I think she's really depending mostly on her team to handle those day in and day out negotiations. I don't think she's at the table on any of these talks. The law firm that is working with Mike Weinstein, I think they're a firm out of Chicago. And they have done these type of deals on other NFL franchises. So they've been there, done that in terms of some of the things that you'd want to look at, touch on, include in these type of negotiations. But my sense is that, and Mayor Deegan has said this as well to us in some of these regular press gaggles or availability she has, is that she has focused, in her words, less on the money part of it and more on the neighborhood benefit part of it, the community benefit part of it. So that's been very important to her. And that gets to some of these things like how is a deal and how is stadium renovation going to positively impact the East Side neighborhood, for example. And that's been a big focus of a lot of nonprofit groups to try and break generational poverty there. So I would say at this point, from my understanding, she has been delegated that authority to Mike Weinstein, gets regular reports back from him, but she has not been actually at the table, nor to my understanding has Shad Khan, for instance, been at the table on behalf of the Jaguars. It's been their representatives or high-level representatives who've been doing the negotiations.
Is the city council, is they got somebody?
This was not.
Go ahead, Mike.
Excuse me. I'm sorry, Mike. I don't mean to interrupt you.
No. I was just, thank you, Mr. Talbot. I was just wondering, is anybody from the city council at the table with him?
There's nobody from city council at the table.
Okay. That was my question as well.
You're not going to let me interrupt you.
Go ahead and finish your thought, Mr. Tolbert.
Well, I had two questions, and I got through one of them. But
Apology.
David, this is not the second question, but you said something that intrigued me, and that is she's more focused on the neighborhoods around the stadium than she is on the money. And I can understand that and appreciate that, but I think taxpayers and voters are going to be more focused on the money than they are on the neighborhood. And I'm not, am I hearing you correctly?
Yeah, I think the way she kind of phrased it that way, I guess, how would I best paraphrase it? Well, first of all, I do think she is focused on the money in the sense that she wants to be able to have a deal that she feels she can bring before voters, bring to city council, justify and defend what the actual financial component of it. I think what I'm trying to convey, or at least what I understood her to say, is that in terms of where she is actually having some of her input most at this stage has been that she really wants to see a community benefit component to this deal. That's where she might, so to speak, try to put her stamp on it as mayor in terms of how the final deal emerges and what the outlines are of it. No, but absolutely, I do think she is. I don't think she's not blind or blithely dismissing the financial aspects of it. And I hope I didn't convey that in terms of kind of my paraphrase of what she told us, because that is the basic threshold question that she's going to have to answer is whatever amount of money it is that the city's putting into it, what is the return to the people of this city for that? And I think part of it, and this would be, what is the community benefit? How does the community benefit as a result of having this? And she's made the argument over and over again that she does feel like the Jaguars being in Jacksonville is a benefit to the city because she faces questions in her town halls from people who say, if the Jaguars stay, great, but I don't want to use a single set of taxpayer dollars to keep them here.
Or other people who say, I don't care about the Jaguars. I'm not a football fan, and I just don't care one way or the other. And I don't see a direct benefit to me, except that I can't get near downtown on a home game day.
Right.
Other than that, Mr. Tolbert, your second question.
My second question, and I guess this is the final one about this particular issue. Recently, Weinstein floated the notion that the city could pay its portion of the cost out of the city's pension fund. Number one, David, can you explain what he's talking about? And number two, is that a pig that can really fly?
Can put lipstick on it, but
Yeah.
Welcome to Mike's on Mike.
No, I'll try to explain it, Mike, in terms of how it works. First of all, one thing that Mayor Deegan said when she talked to Mike Weinstein about it was she said she told Mike, I would like you to think outside the box as you're doing this. And for those of us who know Mike Weinstein, that's kind of like telling Mike Weinstein to be Mike Weinstein, because he's always looking for different creative, innovative, pick your adjective words. And this would kind of fall in that category. So the idea behind it is simply this, is that the police and fire pension fund and the general employee pension fund and the correction officers pension fund, they have total about $5 billion in assets. And their job is to take those assets and invest them in a way that they get returns on those investments so that the investment income is then there to be able to pay for pension benefits as city employees retire and are paid those benefits. So that's their job. Their job is to find ways to invest this money. So Mike Weinstein's argument is that there's a benefit to those pension funds if they were to take a certain amount of it. And let's say out of $5 billion, you took $500 million of that. And you essentially quote, invested that in the stadium renovations, with the city guaranteeing that over a multi-year period of a few decades, the pension funds would get a return on that equal to what their targets are right now for their investments, which is about 6.5%. So from that standpoint, it's the question for the pension funds is, does that make sense for them to do that? And because they're going to be investing it one way or the other. Do they invest it in this way? Do they invest it in, treasury bills where you have a much lower rate of return? Do you go invest it in the stock market where potentially you have a higher rate of return or maybe a lower rate of return? So the argument would be that the pensions would be benefited by this because they would get a guaranteed rate of return on a certain amount of their assets. And that is something that would be beneficial to them, because the reality is every time they do a recalculation of what their assumed rate of return is going to be based on actual returns, it doesn't go up, it goes down each year. Mm-hmm. And because they're constantly realizing that the actual rate of returns is not that great. So to put it in a way, if you are a private investor and someone comes up to you and says, if you want to invest a certain amount of your portfolio, and I'll guarantee you'll get a 6.5% return on it over a 30-year period, does that make sense to you? Is that a good deal for you? Would that make sense for you to have that kind of stability and at least a portion of your assets? Because in this case that the city's good for it. I mean, they'll just raise, that's the reason why it's good to have a city guaranteeing your investment, is because they'll turn around and if they have to, they'll just raise property taxes, right? So,
but that's the point. The point that I think we're going to hear is from those taxpayers who are going to say, wait a minute here. I'm the one who's really on the hook for this thing if it all goes south. And if they can't pay it back, if we don't get the revenue we need to pay back the pension fund, they're going to have to raise taxes. So now you're talking about raising taxes for the benefit of our NFL team. And how is that going to play?
Yeah, I'm just going to kind of use the hypothetical about why it is that it's a good investment to have a city backing your investment, as opposed to, investing in, say, a real estate investment trust or something like that. The flip side for the city is, the pension funds, let's say the pension funds say, you know what, that's a good deal for us. We like the idea that a certain amount of our assets are going to be invested in a way that we get a guaranteed rate of return over a multi-year period. That's a stable source of income that we can then use. It just makes sense for us from an investment standpoint, because, otherwise when the stock market is up, it's down, it's all over the place, right? Now, from the city standpoint, let's say they were to go out right now, to the bond market. Mm-hmm. They could borrow that $500 million at a lower interest rate, like maybe in the high 4% to low 5%. So why would they then want to go to the pension funds and agree to pay them back at a higher rate of return? So that would be one question when it come up. I mean, what's the city's benefit? I mean, the taxpayers are going to end up paying more in interest by doing it this way. Weinstein's argument would be, well, what's good for the pension funds is ultimately good for the city, because the city is in a position where it has to make good on those pension benefits, which it's guaranteed to retirees and those about to retire. So that's the basic thrust of the argument there. And, I in talking to people who have been following this pension saga for a while, a lot of people's initial reaction was, that's crazy. We spent all this time and effort to try and shore up the investments in the pension fund. We got a 0.5-cent sales tax to go to the pension funds. Now we want to take money out, raid the pension fund so that we can go build a stadium. And I sort of get that initial reaction. When you go past that reaction, it becomes a question of this. That money is going to get invested one way or the other. Does it or doesn't it make sense to invest it in the stadium with the guaranteed rate of return by the city? Or does it make more sense for the city to go to the bond market and borrow it in that way? Either way, the taxpayers are on the hook to make sure that this gets paid back.
To me, it's local, and you can watch your investment, as you said, ups and downs at the bond market. plus the fact is, what are we looking at? What's the national debt? What's the national debt at this point? Yeah. So, I mean,
it was more when we started taping the show now than it was when we started.
So when you look at it, it's something local, it's tangible. I mean, I think we'll have a lot of, what do you call them, community huddles, but it's interesting the way you've explained it. But I think to your point, there's a lot of folks out there that are going to have to put that in a way that people understand what you just said. Right. Yeah. And the number of people who are invested in the stock market or who are invested in all that, it's going to be a leap of faith in what that comes to.
No doubt, Mike. And you think about the time it took me to explain it. The whole idea of an elevator speech, that's a pretty tall building to get in that elevator and have somebody focus in on listening to that.
This ain't speed dating.
Because, the first thing I think is, you're raiding the pension fund to do this stadium boondoggle. And that would be the distilled criticism of it. The counter to it is a little more of a nuanced explanation about how the benefits are, the benefits and perhaps detrimental aspects of moving forward in that way.
Yeah. Speaking of rating, let's move on to the JEA story. As this is airing, the trial now will be ongoing because this is the 20th that we're taping this on, folks. Jury has been selected. Tomorrow begins opening arguments. So by the time this airs next Monday, there probably should be into the trial itself. So we have to kind of watch where we are at this point. What are you looking for out of this? What are you hoping to hear from the witnesses? Or if not hoping to hear, is there anything that's going to lift an eyebrow or two, do you think, from the witness list that you've seen?
I've been following pretty religiously Nate Monroe's coverage of this, and Nate has covered it so thoroughly. And so much of the testimony has been kind of aired already in certain forms in some of these pretrial hearings that I don't know that there's anything that would really come across to me as unexpected based on the expected witnesses who are going to be called. Kind of interesting how the government will pull it all together. They're going to have many days of witnesses and testimony. I would be very interested if either, when the defense puts on its case, if either Ryan Wanamaker or Aaron Zahn, who are the two defendants, the two former JEA executives, take the stand and testify. I am interested when the testimony comes forward from Melissa Dykes, who was another high-ranking JEA executive during all of this, was not somebody who was indicted, but will be a witness. I think her testimony is going to be really interesting to hear what she has to say. She was in the room during a lot of this, but that'll be an opportunity too for the defense to really go on the attack, I think, and ask questions about, what she knew, her involvement. So I think that she'll be a really interesting witness when her turn comes to testify. And we really haven't heard a lot about what she will be testifying about.
You think she could flip? Or is there's nothing to flip because she's not being charged.
She's not been charged. Exactly.
Yeah.
So she'll be interesting for sure. And then, the timeline that the prosecution puts together, I think is going to be critical because they're going to have to show that to show a conspiracy, they're going to have to show that it was a repeated pattern over a prolonged period of time. And that's going to be a challenge they'll have in terms of putting their case together.
All right. I'm going to come back and ask a second handicap question. Since you and Nate have, and by the way, you guys have been following this for years and you've done a great job. Thanks to the Times Union. Want a handicap? Are there going to be convictions? What's your handicap?
Yeah. I really can't even answer that question, Mike, because I don't have any frame of reference for this type of a trial. I mean, it's a conspiracy to steal millions of dollars from taxpayers. And that is really something that can resonate with the jury without a doubt, that there was this, the government is saying there was this plan to secretly, take hundreds of millions of dollars that should have been going to taxpayers. It's sale of their city-owned utility to enrich the people who were working as, quote, public servants with a fiduciary duty to the utility. That's really compelling, I think, in terms of the government's case. Now, the flip side, though, obviously, is that this never happened in the sense that it was sort of smoked out by the city council auditor's office.
And by Dave, and by Nate.
And Nate was on it. A lot of people were on this. And so then it never materialized, right? So I think that's something that, would, I think, make potentially your jury ask, well, yes, maybe there was a lot being said and done, but at the end of the day, it didn't happen. So was there really a crime, or was it just, I think Nate Monroe's put it in one of his columns, or was it just a really bad idea that, deserved to sink the proposal to sell JEA, but doesn't rise to the level of a criminal offense.
Mr. Tolbert?
I hear your question, Mike, but I really just don't know.
Yeah.
I just would hesitate to even go out and handicap that because again, this is such a new type of thing for us in Jacksonville. It's not like some of the other corruption trials we've seen in people who were, the government says they did something wrong and they got money, and here's how they used that money. Right. The taxpayers were ripped off for. Yeah. This one,
However, there was a lot of money spent on something that didn't go through.
That's right. And I think the part of the government's case will be that the motivation for putting this community through that entire sales process was at least in part to set the stage for a big payday.
Yeah.
Mr. Tolbert.
Yeah. David, let's change the subject to a minute and talk about the story you wrote about the search for the school board superintendent, a new superintendent. After the board forced Dr. Green to resign, they had a search for a new superintendent, and it ended in October because not many people, or nobody actually, that was qualified applied. Now the school board is starting again. Given the order of the odor of public education in Jacksonville right now, the climate, what do you think the likelihood is that the qualified applicants are going to step up this go round?
Yeah, and it's not just in Jacksonville, it's in Florida. A lot of these big urban counties in Florida have really had a hard time getting highly qualified candidates to come, which sort of seems counterintuitive. I mean, you have a big urban district like Duval County. So if you're a superintendent who wants to move up the ladder, here it is, one of the biggest urban school districts in the country. You have a 50-cent sales tax that voters approved that is going to be pumping hundreds of millions of dollars into the district so you can go out and actually make things happen in terms of improved school facilities. That would seem to be something that would attract a superintendent. Voters approved a property tax increase in order to increase teacher salaries. So you kind of say, well, this is a district that seems to have had some popular support for making the public school system better. So you have all that going for it. And so that's why it is kind of baffling that they had such difficulty last time around attracting a real strong slate of candidates. Their explanation for that was a timing issue. That was school superintendents, they don't like to leave in the middle of a school year. It's a pretty public process. So the idea now is they've circled the date. I think it's May 23rd, where they're saying we're going to have a new superintendent by then. But I don't know, Mike. That's a good question. What has really changed in terms of the dynamic, other than it's a different time in the calendar to be doing this, that's going to get more qualified applicants to come into their pool?
Well, and the one issue that we haven't thrown into this mix is the politics of it all, particularly what's going on in Tallahassee. Because I had heard that was one of the issues that some of the candidates were having, saying, listen, we don't know what these people up in Tallahassee are going to do as far as, once again, sticking their noses into local public education. And we've seen what's happened over the last couple of years in that whole regard with the banning of books and banning of certain classes and topics and things of that sort. What really qualified superintendent candidate's going to want to walk into that fire?
Well, I was going to add to that. There is a perception out there among a number of people that why the school board asked for her resignation, there was pressure from the governor's office to do that. And my understanding is this is not the only big urban area where the perception is the governor wanted another superintendent. So I think that's, you take, whether it's right or not, there is a perception out there. So, you know, if we, a date, but is whoever's picked going to be okay with the governor's office? That's perception. I mean, we don't know that for a fact, but it's out there.
Yeah, well, that's been a reality that the Florida Department of Education has taken a much more aggressive role in terms of oversight, if you want to call it that, or sometimes calling superintendents onto the carpet about their decisions. I think the Leon County superintendent really had to fight to keep his job. So there's out there for sure in that standpoint.
Or picking or endorsing school board members.
And that's the other issue.
The Moms for Liberty deal.
Right. So I think that's probably the other thing for a school superintendent. If you're considering Duval County, you're looking at it's a 7-member board. That 7-member board will hire me. But some of those members of that board may or may not be around over the next 3-4 years. So who's going to be my board, and how might that change, especially when you get these races are becoming more partisan in terms of even though there's no R or D beside the name of the candidate, it's definitely become a more partisan thing. You have the governor endorsing some school board candidates over others. You've had some cases where there's been a change in a school board, and I think it was Southwest Florida. They had a superintendent there who was, by all measures, doing a really good job. The board came to him and said, it's time for you to go. And so if you're a superintendent, you'd like to have some longevity in terms of being able to come in, because one thing about superintendents, this was when I was working as a reporter in Texas, there was a superintendent there in a small district who told me, whenever you're a superintendent and you get hired, you start off with 100% of the people loving you. And every time you make a decision, you have a certain percent who don't love you anymore, and they're gone. You go get them back. They may agree with your other decisions, but they still remember the time they disagreed with you. And so you lose that support over a period of time. And then after 5 years, you move on. And so I think that's something, if you're a superintendent, to Mike's Tolbert's question, I mean, you probably have in the back of your mind, okay, this board might be the one that hires me, but what's the board makeup going to be that I'm going to be working with in the next 2, 3, 4 years of my time there?
So, David, there are 4 school board members out of 7. So we know of two of them are Moms of Liberty, perception. So that's not until November. So we're gonna pick a superintendent, not knowing who their boss is going to be.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. Well, I think that's a dynamic. I mean, if you think about any kind of job where you get hired by somebody, you kind of want to, work for that person. And, and the other part of it is the school board that hires a superintendent. They kind of have a vested interest in their judgment being vindicated. Of
course.
And whereas if you weren't involved in an actual hiring process, maybe you come onto the board and you don't have that same kind of buy-in in terms necessarily. That doesn't mean you come in as an automatic adversary, but you probably don't have that same kind of bonding, so to speak, with the superintendent that you would if you were part of the selection of that person and the hiring of that person. So those are sort of intangibles, but I think they are something that potential candidates would consider at the very least.
Which would be your first question of any candidate running is, what do you think about the new superintendent that we've just hired?
Yeah, that would probably, sure, exactly. Exactly. Are you impressed? Not impressed?
Just to restate, when did they say what's the drop dead date? They're going to suppose it. What's the date they're going to pick a superintendent?
So I think they talked about May 23rd, sometime in late May. And so they are really trying to stick to this schedule, which is we're going to advertise, we're going to get our candidates, and they really want to have somebody on board so that person then can be ready to go in terms of planning for the next school year. So it's really important for them in terms of the transition.
We may have David back.
Yeah, we may.
Well, feel free to invite Steve Patterson, because Steve's the one who covers the school board and does a great job of covering them and knowing what's going on.
We love having the Times Union here.
Yeah,
y'all are important to us.
The Confederate statues, is this a dead issue now, do you think, considering what's going on in Tallahassee with the Senate?
Yeah, it really seems to be.
Yeah.
There were two bills, one in the House, one in the Senate. They were similar, but by no means identical. And they were each moving through the respective chambers. It really sounds like the Senate is where it really hit the big wall, because it got through a couple of committees. And so the next step would have been go to a third committee. But what happened was some of the supporters came out for keeping Confederate statues, and they used sort of rhetoric or language that was really off-putting to some of the senators.
Yeah.
I think the quote from Senator Jennifer Bradley was, you make me want to vote no in terms of hearing, why you want us to keep these Confederate statues up. And she ended up voting yes, but I think that kind of made its way to the Senate president, who then told reporters, I'm not going to bring this legislation to the floor of the Senate. It's not going to get to this final committee stop. And so it's pretty much dead in the Senate. So, it doesn't matter then what happens in the House. And it was kind of a weird thing where you had, it was not neither of them were clean bills. Neither of them was saying, okay, from this date forward, no historic monument can get moved. It was all this stuff about, now you got to go back and restore monuments that had been moved, and there's civil penalties. And at one point there was a threat that somebody, a mayor who agreed to move the monument, could get thrown out of office, even though that flies in the face of what the Florida Constitution itself says is a dismissible offense for a mayor. It was just all over the place. And so they were not simpatico at all. And so that makes it difficult. And, the legislature has a finite amount of time. Yeah. Many are called, few are chosen in terms of these bills.
Right.
And so, they got enough on their plate. They're like, this is more trouble. It's putting, members in really uncomfortable positions. And we got other things to do, and other legislation, other laws to pass. So it does look like it's not happening this session. And this would be 2 sessions in a row that it hasn't happened. And usually if it's going to happen, it usually happens the second session, because you kind of figure out what you did wrong the first session. If you're the bill sponsor, evidently didn't really figure out what went wrong.
Yeah. As Senate President Pasadoma said, it became extraordinarily divisive.
Well, part of it too was, don't forget that in the original bill, there was a section in there where the mayor responsible for removing any of these monuments could have been prosecuted and pay a fine as a result of it. That would have meant going against your former state Republican chairman, Lenny Curry, who was the first one to remove a Confederate statue, and he would have been fined as well. I don't think that would have played well in a lot of Republican circles.
Right, exactly. And there were different time frames. Like at one point, the time frame would have been, all the debate recently has been about these statues are removed from the monuments in Springfield Park.
Right.
But depending how far you back, you would have had to have taken this obelisk that was removed from James Weldon Johnson Park, as it's called now, put it back in the park. And then I guess you'd have to see if you can get the statue that was on top of it from the family that now has it. So it's just almost like, that's why I say it was really the way they put these bills together. It wasn't a clean bill saying, okay, from this point forward, no more, which I think Georgia did that. It was kind of like, no more from this point forward. And by the way, we're going to reverse all these things you did in the past. And it just became so complicated in terms of how they were going about doing that.
Yeah. Plus the new speaker is from Miami.
Right.
And I don't think that Confederate monuments are a big deal in Dade County.
No.
So-
But neither would a monument dedicated to Castro do very well in Miami either.
I think they got other issues in Miami. I don't think
that wouldn't have worked either.
the incoming speaker, I don't think is worried about Confederate monuments.
Nope. You were going to mention something about one of the other issues regarding the airport.
Yes. One of the things that you talked about was our airport. I've recently been out there. It is exploding. I mean, new concourse, more parking. Why? I mean, what's happened? What's happened to North Florida? Why Jacksonville?
Yeah, I think there's air traffic has been up everywhere, but especially in Jacksonville. I mean, they've really found a niche in terms of where they are on this spoke of the hub, and they're doing really well out there. And
because they don't want to go to Tampa, Orlando, or Miami. That's
right.
why.
Yeah, that's a lot of it. You know, you don't want to drive all the way there, and you know, they've worked to get some more direct nonstop flights. I'm sure that's part of it. And they could do even more of that. Though what would happen at the airport is they would add another concourse out there. And by having another concourse, you'd have more gates so they can actually get more of these flights. So that would mean more choice. That's always good for flyers. And that should certainly help to drive up traffic because to Mike's point, it's driving to Orlando is bad enough. Driving back from Orlando after you got on a plane, that's worse.
I did that from Phoenix, and I didn't like that at all. It was terrible.
And so they're obviously they need more parking yesterday. So they're going to be building a brand new parking garage. So there's going to be a huge amount of construction there. Now we're not talking stadium renovation amounts, but when you look at the impact, it's going to have arguably more impact on people because you're going to have more choices for flights, more airlines being able to use Jacksonville, the potential then to have some more nonstop direct flights. And it's just, this is a growing area of Florida. Yeah. I mean, it's not that people are driving to Jacksonville necessarily to catch flights outside of their Southeast Georgia, Northeast Florida market, but it's a growing area. Yeah. And that's reflected by the number of people who are flying in and out of Jacksonville.
That's what happens when Angie Subs gets out there.
Well, let me tell you.
What are you going to do? You know, it's...
and the parking, I went out there, and it's not cheap to park.
No, it's not.
And increased parking is, wow. It's,
Mr. Tolbert, you wanted to ask something about my old friends at FDOT, huh?
Well, I do. David, the interchange at I-95 and 295, which started in 2016, has been scheduled to be completed in April. It's had delay after delay after delay. Do you think that April date's going to hold, or is it going to get moved?
To handicap it, as Mike Hightower would put it, I would not be surprised if it gets moved. I mean, the figures I've seen now, they're talking about spring. So you've mentioned, Mike, that spring has started and when does it end? So
it's a 90-day window.
Right.
It's a big season, isn't it?
And it's just been astonishing. You think about 8 years to do an interchange. I mean, it did not take nearly that long to build the interchange at I-95 and I-295 down in South Jacksonville for the Mandarin area and the South Side. So what's happened is, there's a lot of blame on weather delays. It was a design build project where the same company designed this building.
Who was that? Do you remember?
I don't remember, Mike, who it is,
okay.
but it's one of those projects where there's a lot of earth embankments. So, maybe that's good, maybe that's bad, but there's a lot of work that's been going on around those embankments. And the cost has not gone up, but if you're a driver who has had to go through that over and over again, you just kind of ask yourself, what in the world does it take so long to complete an interchange project in this town on that side?
Some of you may not know this, but if you haven't been on Southside Boulevard since they've done all the re-laning there and getting to Gate Parkway from Southside, it's a bear. It's just a mess of how you get around that and try to navigate that to get from Southside over to eastbound Gate Parkway.
Well, let me tell you, when you talk about that
went on forever.
And Mike Tolbert is 10 and 301. I mean, that's been going on for 10 years at least.
That's your neck of the woods, Mike.
At that intersection down there, 10 and 301.
Mr. Tolbert?
I had a hard time hearing to ask the question again, but let's move on.
Okay, all right, move on. All right, we'll keep this one simple. Former City Council member Brenda Priestley Jackson is running this year against Angie Nixon, something that you called the marquee matchup, I think, Dave.
I think so, yeah.
Tell us about this race.
So I think it's a fascinating matchup. I mean, obviously, Angie Nixon has carved out a place for herself as somebody who's maybe sort of a resistance member in the Florida legislature, willing to take stands.
Lord bless her.
Brenda Priestley Jackson will counter that she's able to, quote, get things done, and that she has a track record there. I think it's going to be sort of two different styles of politicians in terms of how they appeal to voters. And I think it'll say interesting things about what voters in that district really want from their representative. Do they want somebody to go to Tallahassee and maybe get a project or two? If it means sort of not being a thorn in the side of the Republican House leadership and calling them out on things that are being done that negatively affect, in their view, their constituents. How do you balance those two things? And just they have such different political styles, you know. Now, Brenda Priestley Jackson, the interesting backstory I thought was interesting was that at one time, Angie Nixon considered running for city council against Brenda Priestley Jackson, decided to stay in the legislature. Now, Brenda Priestley Jackson is decided not to run for city council after all, is running against Angie Nixon in the legislature. So there's that personal element to it as well. Yeah, right. Exactly. Here, right? I mean, they kind of have sized each other up over time and feel like each is lacking in one area or the other. And, how are voters going to respond to the different ways that they tailor those messages?
Yeah. Two different styles.
Yeah. Completely.
As a good friend of mine would say, this is going to be worth buying the cheap seats to watch. Okay. So, last question got for you. What are the three things of why Jacksonville all of a sudden seems to be in this growth? I mean, we're like the second highest growth area in the state.
Oh,
what's caused?
Yeah.
What's the three things that's caused all of a sudden Jacksonville to be the epicenter of growth and development?
Well, I think my assumptions would be number one, that it's a job magnet. There's been a lot of growth of jobs in the warehouse distribution center. Those are attracting people. I was at a grand opening of a distribution center, and people were introducing themselves. So many of them said, "Yeah, I moved here from Texas, or I moved here from Illinois, or I moved here from New Jersey." I mean, there's a lot of people who are moving from out of state to this city because of the jobs, and I think that's being driven a lot by, in part, by the financial services sector. But there's just a lot of transportation industry jobs that are here. So that's been a draw that perhaps isn't the case in the same level at other cities in Florida. Just being a Florida city is an attraction. I think that helps in terms of how people sort of view the city. And then
our tax rate is very, very, very attractive.
Sure, absolutely.
No state income tax.
And there's room to grow here. Yeah. It's got some room for growth, and not just in Jacksonville and the undeveloped areas here, but certainly in the outlying counties. So I think all that has come together where it's sort of people are moving in, and then obviously when people move in, that requires places to stay, infrastructure, housing,
police, fire, schools, and all the rest of it, right?
So I think Jacksonville has just been able to capture that part of it, Mike. I mean, I don't think it's that people are looking at Jacksonville at this point and saying, "Oh, that's the mecca for some particular, industry that's cutting edge." I mean, I don't think there is a cutting edge industry that's attracting people to Jacksonville. No. The idea of the downtown attracting people, still a lot of mixed reviews in terms of what's happening downtown. So I think it's those broader things. People are moving to Florida. Jacksonville's got the Florida angle, and it's got some advantages within that are people that are going where the jobs are.
Which is Clay County, Nassau County, and St. Johns County.
Right. Mr. Tolbert, you actually have the last question here, and I love this question that you posed.
Yeah, I'm sure David is disappointed to hear that this will be the last question.
Well, yeah, I've enjoyed it. This has been fast. This is great.
But David, you listed 8 news events that we listed here to watch for this year. What didn't make the list but could have?
Oh my gosh, that's a really good question. One thing that I thought about putting on the list was Mayor Deegan's next budget. I was thinking, that's going to be an interesting budget, and it's going to be an interesting budget cycle. And I thought about putting in the ongoing study about a new jail, which it's going to be a huge cost. And I'm not sure that people really have absorbed yet what that's going to cost. Now, at this point, there's a lot of numbers flying around about that, Mike. But when I was talking to Michael Bauerlein, he was saying a figure of maybe it's in the neighborhood of $1 billion.
Wow.
Whoa.
Yeah.
God, I want an apartment.
Those were 2, Mike, that I thought about putting in. And I think those are to be determined, and they're going to grow as issues for sure. Sorry about this.
No, that's okay. It's a good time to lose your throat.
that will take the oxygen out of the room.
Just about it. Well, we don't have much oxygen left anyhow, to be honest with you. All right, guys, we're going to have to wrap it up here. But David, fantastic to have you with us. Thank you so very, very much.
Thank you.
Thanks to you and your colleagues at the Times Union. You guys do a great job, and we appreciate you hanging in there. Y'all are important to us.
We appreciate that, Mike. Definitely. And, we want to thank our readers because, you guys are the ones who follow us, especially people who are devoted newspaper readers, kind of like the Marines, the few and the proud sometimes these days. But we value you guys a lot in terms of when you turn in your opinion pieces and just knowing that you're an audience out there, that means a lot to us.
Well, we appreciate what you're
And
doing.
for people who have called me, by the way, I am not the Michael Miller from Ponte Vedra who writes letters to the editor. I got 3 phone calls on this last one from this past weekend. So I just want people to...
Maybe the lady protests too much. Maybe it is you that's writing that letter.
It depends on the letter that's been written, to be honest with you. All right, guys, thank you all very much. And thank you for tuning in once again to Mike's on Mike, brought to you by the Jacksonville Historical Society in the Jacksonville History Center. Look for us on Facebook, on our website, which is mikesonmikes.com. You can find us on Spotify. You can find us on Apple iPods, and just whatever I'm trying to say. Anyhow, just put us in your Google and you'll find us. Thanks. I guess if you're watching us, you already have. Thanks. Thanks, all of you. We'll see you again next time.
Bye.
Mike's on Mike with Mike Tolbert, Mike Hightower, and Mike Miller can be found on your favorite podcasting platform, Facebook, and YouTube. Visit the website at mikesonmike.com. Join us next time for more conversation with Mike's on Mike.